So I'm going to speak on Caravaggios' masterpieces, which depict the life of St. Matthew in the Contarelli Chapel. This, of course, is in the Church of San Luigi de Francesi, which is close to the Pantheon and obviously the Piazza Navona. I'm also going to speak about kind of the artistic elements that Caravaggio uses to depict these figures in a naturalistic kind of way, but also to kind of employ realism and show these figures in kind of everyday life and realistic settings, thus improving upon kind of high Renaissance painting and artistic value. So this is the Calling of St. Matthew, one of the most famous paintings of the Baroque period, obviously by Caravaggio. And just to lay out some of the figures in this painting, St. Peter is kind of the brutish, gray-haired figure all the way on the right. He stands in front of Christ, who points across the painting, and Matthew, who's the central figure on the left, with the light shining on his face, is pointing at himself. And pretty much what is happening here is this is the calling of St. Matthew, or the conversion of St. Matthew, where Christ points at Matthew, who once was a tax collector, to tell him to join me, follow me, and learn the truth of my teachings. It's amazing how Caravaggio's kind of treatment of light, this is obviously known as chiaroscuro, he's able to almost portray Christ as pointing the light across the room. It's kind of this divine spirit which contributes to this conversion for Matthew. There's almost a delicacy in Christ's features. He seems to be kind of separated from the rest of kind of the scene. Matthew is clearly in disbelief as Christ kind of points at him. You almost can see him saying, "Who, me? Why would you be pointing at me?" And I'd say this is kind of the genius of Caravaggio here, is he's able to depict kind of these figures with an innate naturalism, but also realism. We didn't see this realism in kind of the high Renaissance period with figures, usually portrayed as like Greek gods or as kind of, pinnacles of human performance. But no, here Caravaggio keeps the naturalism, but also shows these folks in a tavern in almost a dirty, humane setting. And so just remarking again, the treatment of light is amazing. These figures kind of emerge out of the darkness with light shining directly on Matthew's face, again, indicative of his conversion. And then one last thing that I'd like to point out in this scene is if you look at Christ's hand, we can see here that it's almost an imitation or reverse reflection of the Adam in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. And I think this kind of invokes this conception of Christ as, in many ways, a second Adam, but also kind of invokes Christ reaching out to the kind of the divine spirit within Matthew to kind of convert him. So this is obviously shows the influence of, the high Renaissance painters like Michelangelo and Caravaggio, but just kind of shows also his a cool kind of symbolism there. So in this painting, obviously the inspiration of St. Matthew, we can see pretty much, these figures emerge from the darkness behind them. St. Matthew on the table, obviously one of the four evangelists, the gospel writers, and it's almost as if he's been being inspired by the angel, which also happens to be one of his four, one of the four tetramorphs, his symbol for the gospel writers. And this angel is inspiring him, is speaking to him. The angel is counting down on his fingers, almost reciting, numerous things to put in the Gospels. And Matthew is looking on attentively. You can tell that he's tired, he's restless, and then he's been working seriously on this endeavor. Again, Caravaggio really kind of, speaks to this kind of naturalism, right? These figures are depicted proportionally and in natural settings, but also kind of this humaneness. Matthew is, shown in kind of a robe. He's shown barefooted. The scene looks, somewhat dirty. And so it's a very humane setting, despite having this really kind of unique naturalism. And again, this chiaroscuro technique is employed. You can see it on the cloth of the angel. It kind of emerges out of darkness. And these figures kind of really highlights these figures. It's almost as if a light is being shown on these figures. The third and final painting of the Contarelli chapel is the Martyrdom of St. Matthew. So the story behind this painting is that St. Matthew was killed on the orders of the king of Ethiopia while celebrating Mass. The king had lusted and wanted his niece for his own bride. However, his niece was actually a nun, and therefore Matthew had dictated that the niece was a bride of Christ, and could not marry the king of Ethiopia. So in the figure illuminated by light is the executioner, St. Matthew. He's withdrawn his sword, and you can see the blood spilling out over the white clothes of St. Matthew. Above the executioner is an angel, also known as the Tetramorph of St. Matthew, who extends a palm frond to him. And at first, it may look like St. Matthew is kind of in terror and awe of the executioner and is afraid, but really Matthew almost kind of reaches for the palm frond, which is being extended by the angel, and so he's not afraid of death, but instead it's being shown that he has this kind of divine connection with the inspiration of Jesus and the divinity, and that, most scholars would argue too that Matthew is really reaching his arm up to kind of extend and grab that palm frond in almost kind of like a divine handshake. And the palm frond, in many ways, is an example from kind of early Christian artwork. It actually kind of stems from Roman times, where victorious athletes were shown with a crown and a palm frond. And in many ways, these Christian martyrs are kind of Christ athletes who have really done the most in this life to be good versions of themselves. In the background, you can see the figure who's kind of looking on behind the executioner is actually considered to be a self-portrait of Caravaggio, and all the figures around kind of this execution have different looks of awe, consternation. It's really an emotional scene which Caravaggio is able to really capture. All these figures kind of emerge out of the darkness. The light is really well treated here, obviously with the chiaroscuro effect as seen in the other two paintings. And the thing I just want to kind of highlight here is that Matthew is really sharing in this kind of angelic vision. He has that divine connection with the angel who extends him the palm frond, and that actually harkens back to the divine connection of the inspiration of St. Matthew, where we saw the angel kind of telling him what to write for the gospel, so he's connecting with that divine spirit, and also harkens back to that divine connection in the calling of St. Matthew, where Jesus points at him, and almost in this shock of awe and consternation, he then accepts to become one of Jesus's apostles. And it's interesting, it's almost kind of these paintings actually in the chapel are kind of opposite of each other. And so it's almost like Matthew in his time of death and despair, he's accepting his fate. He's not afraid. He's reaching up to the heavens. Whereas in the first scene before his conversion, he has that kind of look of surprise. And so it just shows how far Matthew's come. I mean, Caravaggio's artistic elements, once again, are amazing. He shows this kind of amazing naturalism, these proportion of the human body, obviously influenced by Michelangelo and the old masters, and the Renaissance painters. But he also has that kind of innate realism of everyday life, which I think a lot of us can appreciate. So yeah. It's also telling just to show how, in this kind of Baroque period, martyrs were really shown with this kind of angelic and victorious stance rather than, a tragic vision. For example, Bernini's Santa Bibiana, the Santa Bibiana Church, is shown in kind of this victorious pose, again with the palm frond, kind of showing this amazing kind of performance for the glory of God. Obviously harkening back to kind of Roman athleticism, and instead these are kind of Christ athletes who remain victorious in this world.